The city of Blackridge was alive with its usual chaos: honking cars, crowded streets, and neon lights flashing atop skyscrapers. But within hours, everything changed. It started with strange news reports, violent attacks, people biting each other, and authorities losing control. At first, most dismissed it as fake news or a drug-induced frenzy. Then, the screaming began. David Carter, a 32-year-old mechanic, was working the late shift when the first wave hit. He heard the sirens, saw people running in the streets, but nothing could have prepared him for the horror that followed. A bloodied man slammed against the garage's glass window, clawing and gnashing his teeth. David watched in shock as the man was tackled by police, only for the officers to be overwhelmed by a swarm of the infected. His instincts screamed, "Run! Hide! Survive!" David locked the garage doors and ran to the back, grabbing a wrench as his only weapon. He wasn't alone. Emily, a teenage girl who worked at the diner next door, had rushed in for cover. She was trembling, her phone shaking in her hands as she tried calling her mother. No signal. The networks were failing. The world outside was crumbling. A deafening crash. A car swerved off the road, slamming into a fire hydrant. From the wreck emerged a woman, limping, covered in bite wounds. She turned toward David's shop, her milky white eyes locking onto him. And then she ran. Not walked. Not stumbled. Ran. David barely had time to bolt the door before she threw herself at it, shrieking like a rabid animal. More of them emerged from the shadows, drawn by the noise, their unnatural movements sending chills down his spine. The city wasn't just falling. It had already fallen. He turned to Emily. "We can't stay here." She nodded, wiping tears from her face. They had to move. They had to find safety. But where? The streets were a war zone, cars abandoned, bodies strewn everywhere. The police had been overwhelmed within hours. The military was nowhere to be seen. The infected weren't just hunting. They were multiplying. David gritted his teeth. They had two options: stay and die, or take their chances out there. With a deep breath, he made his choice. They were going to fight their way out. David and Emily crouched behind a row of overturned garbage bins, their breath shallow as the distant screams echoed through the streets. The infected were everywhere, their movements erratic yet unnervingly purposeful. "We need to get to higher ground," David whispered. "Somewhere we can see what's going on." Emily swallowed hard and nodded. Her hands trembled, clutching a metal rod she had picked up from the wreckage outside. David scanned the area. There was an old department store across the street. If they could make it to the rooftop, they might find a way out of the city or at least figure out where to go next. But reaching it wouldn't be easy. A group of infected loitered nearby, some twitching violently, others sniffing the air like predators searching for prey. Their bloodied faces were barely human anymore, their eyes hollow and hungry. David motioned for Emily to follow him. They moved carefully, stepping over shattered glass and debris. Every noise, every shift of rubble beneath their feet, made their hearts race. Then, a loud crash behind them. Emily had accidentally knocked over a metal can. The infected snapped their heads toward them. For a split second, there was silence. Then, they screamed and charged. "Run!" David shouted. They sprinted toward the department store, dodging obstacles, their hearts pounding like war drums. The creatures were fast, faster than anyone should be. One lunged at Emily, its clawed hands swiping inches from her shoulder. David swung his wrench with all his strength. Crack! The creature's skull caved in, but more were coming. They reached the department store's entrance, shoving through the glass doors. The interior was dark, shelves knocked over, blood splattered across the floors. They weren't alone. Somewhere inside, something growled. David grabbed Emily's hand and pulled her toward the escalators. The power was out, but they climbed the steps two at a time, desperate to reach the rooftop exit. Behind them, shadows moved. A lone figure stepped into the dim light, a man. He wasn't infected. He was alive. And he was holding a gun. "Stop right there," the man ordered, raising his weapon. His face was grim, his clothes torn and bloodied. "Are you bit?" David and Emily froze, raising their hands. "No," David panted. "We're clean." The man studied them for a moment before nodding. "Come with me if you want to live." David hesitated but then heard the guttural screeches from downstairs. They didn't have time to argue. Whoever this man was, he might be their only chance at survival. They followed him into the unknown. David and Emily followed the stranger through the darkened aisles of the department store. The man moved quickly, his pistol aimed at every shadow, his breathing steady. He had clearly done this before. "What's your name?" David whispered as they navigated through a storage area filled with overturned shelves. "Marcus," the man replied without looking back. "And if you want to stay alive, keep your voice down." Emily clutched David's arm, her wide eyes scanning the darkness. The low growls of the infected echoed from below, reminding them that they weren't safe yet. Marcus led them to a maintenance door near the back. He pulled out a key and unlocked it, revealing a hidden staircase leading upward. "You got a safe place?" David asked. Marcus didn't answer immediately. Instead, he locked the door behind them and started climbing. Safer than most. The stairwell smelled of dust and old metal, but more importantly, it was quiet. The infected hadn't gotten in here yet. After several flights, Marcus stopped at a reinforced door and knocked twice. A small peephole slid open, and another set of eyes peered out. "It's me," Marcus said. The door creaked open. Inside was a makeshift survival camp. A group of 5 people sat among supplies, food, water, even a small generator buzzing softly in the corner. They had weapons. A shotgun rested against a crate, and a machete was strapped to a chair. David's instincts flared. Something felt off. "This is David and Emily," Marcus introduced. "Found them downstairs. They're clean." A bald man with a scar across his forehead stepped forward. His sharp eyes scanned them both, his lips curling into a smirk. "I'm Carter," the man said. "Welcome to the last safe place in Blackridge." Emily exhaled with relief, but David wasn't convinced. The others, 3 men and 2 women, didn't look welcoming. They looked desperate. Hungry. Dangerous. David had seen this before. When the world fell apart, it wasn't just the infected you had to fear. It was people. "You two must be tired," Carter continued. "Why don't you rest a bit? We'll talk later." David didn't move. He could feel it in his gut. This wasn't a rescue. It was a trap. And now, they were locked inside. David's grip on his wrench tightened as he scanned the room. The so-called safe haven felt more like a cage. Carter and his group had weapons, supplies, and calculating eyes. Emily, oblivious to the tension, sank onto a nearby crate, rubbing her sore legs. "At least we're safe for now," she murmured. David wasn't so sure. Carter sat across from them, cracking his knuckles. "So, let's talk. Food's running low. We've been careful about who we let in. You too? You gotta pull your weight." David tensed. "We can help." Carter smirked. "Oh, I know you can." He motioned toward Marcus, who stood by the door like a guard dog. "You see, we got a supply run coming up. Problem is, we need a distraction." David's stomach dropped. "You want us to be bait," he said flatly. Carter chuckled. "Smart guy." He leaned forward. "Look, we don't gotta make this messy. You go outside, make some noise, and lead the dead away while we grab what we need." David glanced at Emily. Her face paled as realization set in. "And if we refuse?" David asked. Carter's smirk vanished. then you're just wasting food and space. The room fell silent. David weighed his options. If they refused, they'd be thrown out, or worse. If they agreed, they'd be sent to die. Either way, they weren't walking out of here alive. Emily shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting toward Marcus. The man wasn't looking at them, his jaw was clenched, like he knew what was about to happen but refused to interfere. David took a slow breath. Fine. We'll play along. He forced a nod. All right. We'll do it. Carter grinned. Good. You leave at dawn. David and Emily were given a dusty corner to rest. The others returned to their business, some sharpening knives, others whispering among themselves. The shotgun in the corner was left unattended. Emily leaned close. David, what do we do? David's voice was low, controlled. We don't wait till dawn. They needed a plan. They needed to get out. David didn't sleep. He couldn't. Every instinct screamed that if they stayed until dawn, they wouldn't live to see the sunrise. Emily curled up beside him, trying to rest, but he could tell she was just as tense. Across the room, Carter and his people murmured among themselves. Occasionally, they threw glances in David and Emily's direction, like hunters watching prey. David leaned in close to Emily. We leave now. Quietly. She nodded, her eyes wide with fear. The plan. The shotgun still rested against a crate on the far side of the room. Marcus was dozing near the door, but the others were distracted. David whispered, I'll grab the gun. You be ready to run. Emily swallowed and nodded. David moved slowly, heart pounding in his ears. The room smelled of stale sweat and dust, the dim light from a flickering lantern casting long shadows. He reached the shotgun. His fingers wrapped around the cold metal. Then, a voice. You sure you want to do that? Marcus. He was awake. And his hand was on his pistol. David's heart slammed against his ribs. He could hear Emily's sharp intake of breath behind him. But Marcus didn't shout. Didn't alert the others. Instead, he sighed and rubbed his face. I figured you wouldn't wait, Marcus muttered. He stood up, adjusting his belt. Carter's not gonna let you walk out of here alive. David kept his grip on the shotgun. Then help us. Marcus hesitated. His jaw clenched. Then, to David's surprise, he nodded. I'll get you out, Marcus said, voice low. But if you slow me down, I leave you behind. David nodded. It was a deal. The escape. Marcus led them to a small ventilation shaft near the storage room. Carter doesn't know about this exit, he whispered. Emily squeezed in first. David followed, the shotgun awkwardly pressed against his side. As they crawled through the metal tunnel, they heard raised voices. Where the hell are they? Carter had realized they were gone. Then came the pounding footsteps. David gritted his teeth. They were almost out. Bang! A bullet ripped through the vent, barely missing them. They had been spotted. Move! Marcus barked. They burst out onto the rooftop. Cold night air hit them as they sprinted across the cracked concrete. Below, the streets swarmed with infected, but Carter's men were their bigger problem. The door behind them burst open. There they are. Kill them! Gunfire erupted. Marcus fired back, taking down one of Carter's men. David grabbed Emily's hand. There was only one way down. A fire escape. Without thinking, he jumped, dragging Emily with him. They slammed onto the metal stairs below, pain jolting through their legs. Marcus followed, cursing under his breath. Above, Carter roared, You can't run forever. David didn't look back. They hit the alleyway and sprinted into the shadows. They were free. But the city was still a nightmare. And now, they had two enemies. The infected. And Carter's gang. David, Emily, and Marcus ran through the dark alleys of Blackridge, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The gunshots had stopped, but that didn't mean they were safe. "Keep moving," Marcus muttered. "Carter won't let this go." David knew he was right. Carter and his gang weren't the type to forgive betrayal. They would hunt them down. But that wasn't even their biggest problem. The city was crawling with the infected. As they reached a deserted intersection, David pulled Emily behind a wrecked car. Marcus crouched beside them, reloading his pistol. "We can't keep running like this," Emily whispered. "Where do we go?" David scanned their surroundings. The streets were littered with corpses, and the distant groans of the undead filled the air. Every building looked like a potential death trap. Then he spotted it, an old subway entrance. "Underground," David said. "The tunnels might be clear." Marcus hesitated. Or they might be worse. But they didn't have a choice. They moved carefully, stepping over shattered glass and abandoned luggage. The stairway leading down was covered in graffiti and dried blood. A broken subway map flickered under a dying light. Emily wrinkled her nose. "It stinks." David lifted his shotgun. Better than being out in the open. The darkness below. They descended into the tunnels, the air growing thick and stale. The overhead lights flickered weakly, casting eerie shadows along the walls. Marcus led the way, gun raised. David kept Emily close, his eyes darting to every dark corner. The silence was almost worse than the noise. Then, a sound. A low, wet-chewing noise. They rounded a corner and froze. A group of infected knelt over a half-eaten body, their fingers dripping with gore. They twitched, sniffing the air. Then, one of them turned. Its pale, lifeless eyes locked onto them. It shrieked. The others snapped their heads up. Blood dripped from their mouths. And then they charged. "Run!" Marcus shouted. They sprinted down the tunnel, their footsteps echoing in the darkness. The infected were fast, their snarls growing louder. David spotted a maintenance door and yanked it open. Inside. Emily dove through, followed by Marcus. David slammed the door shut just as the first infected slammed into it. They backed away, panting. The creatures screeched and clawed at the metal. But they were trapped outside. For now. Marcus exhaled. Well, that was close. Emily leaned against the wall, shaking. "Where do we go now?" David looked around. They were in an abandoned service room filled with old tools and supplies. Then his eyes landed on something. A map of the subway tunnels. He traced a path with his fingers. There was an exit on the other side of the city. If they could get through the tunnels, they might reach it. But the infected weren't their only problem. Because on the edge of the map, scrawled in red paint, were the words. "Stay out. They're watching." David's blood ran cold. Who was watching? And what was waiting for them in the tunnels? David traced the red warning on the subway map with his fingers. "They're watching." "What does that mean?" Emily whispered. Marcus exhaled sharply. "Probably nothing good." The infected outside still clawed at the door, but the metal held. For now. David studied the map. The tunnel ahead would take them under the city toward an emergency exit near the outskirts. It was their best shot. "Let's move," he said. They slipped into a narrow service corridor, stepping over rusted pipes and discarded tools. The air was thick with mildew and decay, and a distant dripping sound echoed through the darkness. Something else is down here. The deeper they went, the stranger the tunnel felt. The walls were marked with deep scratches. Doors had been ripped off their hinges. Old maintenance lights flickered, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. "This place," Emily shivered. "It doesn't feel right." David agreed. Then, they heard it. A sound different from the infected. A slow, deliberate clicking noise. David signaled for them to stop. The clicking grew louder. Closer. Marcus tightened his grip on his pistol. "What the hell is that?" Then they saw it. A figure emerged from the darkness ahead. At first, it looked human. But as it stepped into the dim light, David's stomach twisted. Its limbs were too long, its skin pale and stretched, its jaw unnaturally wide, lined with needle-like teeth. But its eyes? It had no eyes. Instead, its head twitched, as if listening. The clicking grew louder. It was echolocating. Hunting. Run or die. Emily gasped. The creature's head snapped toward her. Then, it screeched. David didn't think. Run. They sprinted through the tunnels, their footsteps pounding against the concrete. The creature pursued them at terrifying speed, its limbs twisting unnaturally as it moved. Marcus fired 2 shots, both missed. The creature leapt, almost on top of them. David swung the shotgun like a bat, slamming the stock into its head. The creature stumbled, shrieking, but it wasn't down. Up ahead, a train car lay derailed inside the tunnel. Inside. David shouted. They scrambled into the wreckage, squeezing through a broken door. The creature slammed into the side of the train, its claws raking against the metal. David, panting, reloaded his shotgun. What the hell was that? Marcus shook his head. I don't know, but that wasn't a zombie. Emily hugged her knees, shaking. If those things are down here, she whispered, how many more are there? The clicking sound returned. And then, more of them answered. From every direction. David's hands went cold. They weren't trapped with one. They were trapped with a horde. David traced the red warning on the subway map with his fingers. They're watching. What does that mean? Emily whispered. Marcus exhaled sharply. Probably nothing good. The infected outside still clawed at the door, but the metal held. For now. David studied the map. The tunnel ahead would take them under the city toward an emergency exit near the outskirts. It was their best shot. Let's move, he said. They slipped into a narrow service corridor, stepping over rusted pipes and discarded tools. The air was thick with mildew and decay, and a distant dripping sound echoed through the darkness. Something else is down here. The deeper they went, the stranger the tunnel felt. The walls were marked with deep scratches. Doors had been ripped off their hinges. Old maintenance lights flickered, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. This place, Emily shivered. It doesn't feel right. David agreed. Then, they heard it. A sound different from the infected. A slow, deliberate clicking noise. David signaled for them to stop. The clicking grew louder. Closer. Marcus tightened his grip on his pistol. What the hell is that? Then they saw it. A figure emerged from the darkness ahead. At first, it looked human. But as it stepped into the dim light, David's stomach twisted. Its limbs were too long, its skin pale and stretched, its jaw unnaturally wide, lined with needle-like teeth. But its eyes? It had no eyes. Instead, its head twitched, as if listening. The clicking grew louder. It was echolocating. Hunting. Run or die. Emily gasped. The creature's head snapped toward her. Then, it screeched. David didn't think. Run. They sprinted through the tunnels, their footsteps pounding against the concrete. The creature pursued them at terrifying speed, its limbs twisting unnaturally as it moved. Marcus fired 2 shots, both missed. The creature leapt, almost on top of them. David swung the shotgun like a bat, slamming the stock into its head. The creature stumbled, shrieking, but it wasn't down. Up ahead, a train car lay derailed inside the tunnel. Inside. David shouted. They scrambled into the wreckage, squeezing through a broken door. The creature slammed into the side of the train, its claws raking against the metal. David, panting, reloaded his shotgun. What the hell was that? Marcus shook his head. I don't know, but that wasn't a zombie. Emily hugged her knees, shaking. If those things are down here, she whispered, How many more are there? The clicking sound returned. And then, more of them answered. From every direction. David's hands went cold. They weren't trapped with one. They were trapped with a horde.